This is Creativity Drill with Dr. Don and Jonathan Rundman.
Hey, listeners. This is Jonathan, the co-host of the show, and you are in for a treat today because the guest is David Casimir, who is just an incredible friend of ours from years and years ago, and also a biotech lawyer, and he's also a songwriter and incredibly thoughtful and creative person in general. And your mind will be blown, and your nerd energies will be heightened, and it's going to be a really good one. We've had a lot of listeners to the show as it's been going now. They think this is the 6th episode, and it's just super fun to know that everybody's listening and having a good time. And man, you are in for a great one today. This is David Casimir.
Rolling.
Hey, everyone. This is Dawn, and we're here broadcasting another podcast, this time with our friend Dave Casimir. And so we want to welcome Dave to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
We're glad to have you. And we have known Dave for a very, very long time. So Jonathan's roots go back the farthest to, what would it be?
Fifth grade.
Fifth grade.
Yeah, this is the guest we've had that maybe has the deepest connections to both of us. And I've known Dave since 5th grade when we played a trombone in the band together. And high school and other adventures, middle school. And even Dawn and Dave have high school connections because they were both in the advanced math and science groups of the high schools in Upper Michigan where we grew up. And so where did you guys see each other?
Well, we were at the Chemistry Olympics together, I think, when I was a senior and you were a junior.
As vicious competitors.
Yes.
Are you serious? You were on competing teams?
Yeah.
Well, on opposing teams, though.
Opposing teams.
Yeah.
Not in direct competition. And then we figured that we probably were at the same math competitions in 5th, 6th, and 7th grade.
Junior high years, right.
Junior high years. Yeah, maybe starting in 5th or 6th
because
grade.
I know that you could remember your opponents from Houghton.
Although you were ahead of me, so you
was.
you had the gentleman from Houghton who would always get the perfect score.
Yes. But we would place in the top 10 or top 20 or whatever and go downstate, and that was super fun. So anyway, we go way back and have lots of brainy, fun activities together. But we're here now to talk with Dave about creativity because there is much about Dave's whole life that is very creative and that involves working with creative people. And so if you were going to describe your current vocational situation, Dave, what would you say?
So I am a patent attorney.
Ooh.
Or I guess more generally an intellectual property attorney. I primarily work with patents, but I also do copyrights and trademarks and trade secrets and all the other weird forms of intellectual property. I run my own business with a group of about 20, I think we have 25 people.
Cool.
So I day to day end up working with or against inventors, artists, sort of people who are creating creative content.
All right. And so, of course, we have to go the next step and say, how does an intellectual property attorney work with creative people, and what is creative about what you do in your job working with the creative people?
Yeah, so it's kind of a big question, so I'll take it off in little bites, and you can interrupt me with sub-questions if I'm talking too much.
Okay.
But it kind of gets to what intellectual property is in the first instance, and I probably need to mention that because it's a topic that we never learn about anywhere in our lives. So I imagine a lot of the listeners might not, while they may have heard the term and heard of patents, copyrights, trademarks, maybe hasn't ever really thought about it because we just never learn about it anywhere. So what intellectual property is it's basically property rights in ideas or the aspects of ideas, the expression of ideas. They're government-created rights, so it sort of allows someone to own something they came up with in their mind. We think about real property like houses and cars and land where you can sort of physically own and possess something.
And other people can see it.
And other people can see it.
Feel it. And
it's hard for them to take it. So, for example, if you own a house, it's hard for someone to just come and take your house or make 1,000 copies of your house and run off with it.
And put them for free on the internet.
Exactly. But it was recognized very, very early on that there was value to intellectual property, ideas, and that for a number of reasons, people ought to be able to own them, at least for a period of time, that there was a benefit to doing that. And people debate whether that's true or not, and it's a very good debate to have. But so basically, laws got created to allow people to own aspects of their ideas so they could control them by themselves, sell them to others, lease them, loan them, do all the things you can do with real property with ideas.
Now, you mentioned earlier, you said this is a government, what's the language you just used? Government created, what did you say before?
I don't know exactly what I said, but it's a government created right.
So that made me think, does anybody ever think about this stuff apart in even larger than government, like in a universal or human right?
Yes. People definitely do.
Beyond a government reach, beyond politics or countries and states and things.
Yes, and a lot of the roots of the government rights come out of what some people think of as a moral right. And in fact, you'll hear that phrase used a lot in the world of intellectual property. One of the arguments for why governments created protection for intellectual property is this idea of this moral right, that if you've created something, you should have some ownership of it. One of the reasons there needs to be protection is an idea is not something you can hang on to like a house or a car or a pencil or a chair. Once the idea is out there, people can basically copy it and run with it freely, and you lose control of it so easily. And so I think the main two arguments for having a legal structure around this, one was this moral issue that we recognize that when people come up with something like that, it ought to be protected. And it's something that needs to be protected, at least in some cases. But the other is an economic one, which is to say, if we have a legal structure to allow people to own their ideas, at least for a period of time, and make a living on it or make an income on it, it will incentivize people to make more stuff. And then that's good for society or good for the economics of a country.
Is there some sort of standard that people around the globe would use to talk about the moral rights of an artist or of a creative inventor or whoever?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it varies in every way that one could talk about moral issues from any other context.
Right.
If you look around, you'll see people argue about it being a natural right. You'll hear probably religious arguments for it, kind of personal property arguments for it. All the things you would hear about any sort of moral discussion, you'll hear.
Is there some variety then within cultural traditions?
There is, and that's actually caused some friction. In modern days, almost every country in the world all the big economic powerhouses have signed treaties with each other to protect patents, copyrights, trademarks, and the laws around the world are all pretty similar now. And that creates some tension because different cultures value these things differently. So in Europe, for example, with respect to art, music, there's a much stronger view of it being a moral right than you see in the United States. But the laws are nearly identical between those two areas. Now, they are a little bit stronger in Europe related to some of these moral aspects.
I wonder if that's why some European countries will have government funds to preserve the careers of the artists and musicians in their country.
Absolutely.
Where here in America, that's not as big of a deal for our culture.
And I would say it's the opposite here in our culture, right?
Yeah.
You're on your own, kid.
Exactly.
Yeah. Hit the road. Throw that guitar in the car and hit the road and play. Wow, that's super interesting. Now, is there a version of you in every society on the globe? Yeah,
pretty much. Now, I mean, you could probably find some isolated tribes living in a jungle that don't have an intellectual property regime. But yeah, today, pretty much any country you can name has some organization that to some degree protects some aspects of intellectual property. It does vary country to country.
When you started your career, you actually started not in law school, but you started postgraduate, entered into a PhD program.
Yes.
In biochemistry.
Yes.
Sorry. And did you know, even from the time you were an undergrad or even a teenager, I would like to be an intellectual property lawyer regarding the sciences? Or how did that sort of realization come to be, who you are now professionally?
So I definitely did not have that thought. I actually never had a good opinion of attorneys, and maybe even today I don't, being one. But I think my story is actually nearly identical to everyone who ends up in my vocation, which is to say, you do something else. I was a scientist for a while, and then you find out you don't want to do that anymore, and you sort of find intellectual property along the way. And the reason you see a lot of people going from a science track in particular into intellectual property is I was part of a subset of scientists whose passion was learning about science. Not so much necessarily the doing of it, but the being on the steep part of the learning curve, getting into something new and being excited about learning about it. And there's not really jobs for that in science. There are some, but the majority of the jobs are the doing. And I was okay at the doing, but I had no passion for the doing.
Doing, you mean like in the lab with the chemicals and the rats?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And your study was on lipids,
Yeah,
right?
my graduate school research was, yes.
Okay.
Well, at least it was fodder for lots of great jokes about mice and rats and fat rats and weight loss in rodents and stuff.
Yeah.
It
We
was.
still milk that for jokes now.
And I still consider myself a scientist. So that hasn't changed. I actually consider myself more of a scientist than I do a lawyer. But so almost everyone in my field sort of is in that same camp. And then you find out about intellectual property, which is a world where you get to be on the steep part of the learning curve. You're always working with, in my case, primarily scientists, but I do copyrights and other things as well. So artists, and you're always sort of learning new things. In a given year, I'll work on, I'm just trying to guess here, 100 or 200 different things where I get to become a mini expert on them. And it's just completely intellectually thrilling.
So you have to just crash course yourself in whatever field this is and become an expert on it for that particular case.
Exactly. And I would say a mini expert. A lot of these things would take years and years and years to become an expert, but that's exactly the sweet spot for my brain, is to become a mini expert on as many things as possible.
Wow.
So does that mean most of your work is actually, like, you can't talk about it because it's in that initial stage and things are still protected and trade secrets and proprietary?
So it depends. On the patent side, that's definitely true, because one of the rules of the patent system is you have to have your thing into the government and being reviewed by the government before you talk about it publicly. So I learn about a lot of secret things before they're made public. On the copyright and trademark side, not so much. You're working with stuff that is either out there in the public already or just about to be out there in the public.
So have you seen a situation go terribly wrong in the first instance where someone kind of blabs about their invention before they get the patent for it and it ruins them? Does that happen?
Yes, all the time.
Wow. All the time.
Can you tell us any specifics about that, or sort of talk about that more theoretically of what happens when you're not sort of following the proper practices for protecting your property?
Yeah, no, so this is just for patents. So for copyrights, you don't run into this issue. So for artists, writers, musicians, it's not as big of a deal. But if you're an inventor and your thing is going to be protected by a patent, there's an obligation to get your patent in place before it becomes publicly known. And a lot of inventors don't realize that. Now, if you're sort of a serial inventor, and by that I don't mean you're inventing cereal, although you might be, but you're an inventor who is repetitively inventing things, you learn about the system and you know about this. But a lot of people doing their first invention, or a lot of university professors where there's sort of a climate of sharing information, are just not good at keeping secrets. So the stuff gets out. And I've seen dozens and dozens and dozens of things sort of go out there in the public before the patent was put in place.
Can someone then come in and patent it before the originator patents it because there's gain in that? Does that happen?
No. So once someone puts it out in the public, it sort of ruins the patent for everyone. They can't get it, and no one else can either. Now, in the United States, there's a 1-year grace period for your own. If you mention something publicly, you get a year to get a patent in place. But everywhere else in the world, it's dead the day you talk about it. So you lose your international rights immediately. So you get a little bit of a grace period in the United States.
So keep your mouth shut.
Definitely.
Okay.
And it's ways even people talking at the water cooler can be too much talking. Mm-hmm. People talking to family members at a family reunion before you get your patent filed can be too much talking.
Wow.
You really do have to keep these things a secret.
So if you're inspired by part of someone else's work, and you decide, you improve on that, and then you want to pursue that as an invention, is that another tension point where someone can recognize, wait, you stole the first part of this? Or what are some of the disputes that can happen in the midst of that process?
Generally what you mentioned happens all the time, and it doesn't cause disputes. Actually, the whole idea of the patent system is for the government to give you this protection, to protect your idea. One of the requirements is you have to share what you did with everyone else, and early on. And the idea behind that is And for patents, you get 20 years of protection. If you've invented something, you get to say who gets to do the thing for 20 years or use it or make it or sell it. In exchange for that, you have to tell people what you did right away.
I'm opening a candy. Just so you know.
And that packaging, that probably at one point or another was patented. Maybe even the recipe for the chocolate.
I'm eating a chocolate.
I bet the foil-y type packaging that has the printing on the other.
Oh, almost certainly.
Yeah. Certainly. Okay.
So, but the idea is we want people to learn about these inventions and then make the next best thing. So the idea is we want people to copy what someone else did and do the next thing on top of it. Now, if they copy too close and they violate the other person's patent, they have to wait 20 years to do that. But the idea of sort of inventing the next best thing is built into the system and is very, very common.
Now, that seems highly altruistic, that a system is in place so that people will create more, invent more. I mean, is it truly that? Or how are we to the point where there is actually a system that encourages people to keep being creative?
Well, the altruism is actually built into it. And it's this whole idea of when it was decided that the government was going to give someone protection, basically it gives you a monopoly to control something. And this is true of art, a painting, a song, an invention. The artistic stuff falls in the copyright side. The sort of the functional, practical stuff, not that art isn't practical, but the physical things are on the patent side. They're day one to get this monopoly, which we're generally against monopolies in the country, you have to give something up. And that giving up is the sharing of the information. So the altruism was built in as an exchange. In exchange for getting this protection by the government, you have to give something up. And what you have to give up is you have to share that information with the world. And so it's built right into the system, that this altruism. So I don't know that people would naturally be altruistic, but then by not, they could opt out of the patent system. What that basically means is you have a trade secret, but it's hard to keep a lot of things secret.
What are some of your favorite trade secrets that you know about? Not the secrets themselves, but like companies that you know that have trade secrets.
So very few things are kept trade secret anymore. It tends to be things like manufacturing processes where you can keep it behind, in a brick building with no windows and no one can know about it. Recipes and things like that. The famous one's the Coca-Cola recipe. Although there isn't sort of a Coca-Cola recipe, there's many, many of them and they've changed over the years. So there's not sort of a 1920 secret recipe sitting in a vault somewhere that's still being used. But, it's things like that are kept as trade secrets.
You don't have any favorites?
I actually don't have favorite trade secrets.
I saw a documentary on TV about some family business out on Baltimore on the East Coast someplace, and they're the family for the last 150 years who've made paper money for the American what's it
Treasury,
called? For the mint.
Yeah.
And so their family has the secret recipe for, it's like a sludge of cotton and water that is stirred in a giant vat, and it makes that sort of half paper, half cloth quality that our money has, and it's super secret because they don't want counterfeiting happening. But they've got it, and they control it, and they make these wonderful bills, and the artwork is just extraordinarily beautiful and incredible. And it's almost like the Vatican, or like it has this sort of high level, like almost like it's almost like a civic religion about the quality of their trade secret.
That's true. And actually, I forgot about that one, so that's my favorite one.
That's definitely my favorite. This talking about sort of altruism and moral obligations and moral rights and all this stuff makes me remember last year I got summoned for jury duty, and I had never had that before, and I'd never been to court before, and I'd never only lawyers I know are people like you who I know in my personal life, but I don't talk to them. I've never seen a lawyer in action other than in the movies. So I got summoned for jury duty, and I went down there to the government center in Minneapolis, and I actually got called up to be on a jury, and they brought us all in, and we spent a couple hours with the judge eliminating, I think there were 24 of us and they needed 12, whatever it was.
Right.
So they eliminated people for whatever reason, and I was so deeply moved to be there with the judge and with the attorneys and in the government center, because the way, especially the judge, who I thought was extraordinarily wonderful about how he described what we were doing, it elevated the experience to this sort of privilege and yet deep responsibility, and it really felt like, wow, we are keeping this society from becoming a zombie apocalypse.
Right.
Because if we don't have this altruism and this sort of like we're measuring this by codes that aren't quantifiable, it's just out of some sort of mysterious goodness that we're trying to capture and righteousness of the rights of humans, and to see this happening sort of in this political and societal context, I thought it was absolutely beautiful. And I was on a high, and I walked out of it thinking, I need to go to law school, or I want to be a bailiff. I just want to be with people who are talking about this. Because do you ever have moments where you get caught up in it and you feel like this is really, there's a beauty to it or a holiness
or
almost
transcendence.
Yeah, there's a transcendence.
Yeah.
I don't know. Does that happen?
Yes, it does. I mean, so it's. A lot of people don't like our legal system because a lot of times when they're encountering it, they're in a bad position personally, or it's inconvenient for them. And I'm actually glad to hear you describe what you just did, because if you get an opportunity to see it from sort of a more neutral standpoint, and it's not terribly inconvenient to be on the jury duty, it really is that. Our legal system and the legal systems around the world, our sort of court system, our judicial system, exists as an alternative to duels and people punching each other out.
Yeah, zombie apocalypse.
Yeah, and that is totally the purpose of it. And in this country in particular, we have there's obviously always some corruption in everywhere, but we have an incredibly uncorrupt judicial system. It's filled with really smart people who generally, the vast majority of them, care about doing a good job. Obviously there's bad people in every job, and you can point to bad mistakes, and they show up in the media all the time. But in reality, it's a really honorable system that serves its purpose of preventing zombie apocalypses.
Yeah,
absolutely right.
Yeah,
and it is exciting to see that. Now, I also see this in intellectual property law. You see this in sort of all areas of law. You get the politics and the lobbying and all those aspects coming into it. But then you get to see pushback on that from the judicial system itself. If things get too unfair, the things get shifted back in the other direction. So it's kind of a swinging pendulum. The judicial system really does a good job of, if things get a little too crazy, fixing it, and then maybe gets a little too crazy the other direction. But overall, it's really rational and kind of fun to see. It's one of the better things humans have created.
Did you have a turning point in your own career development where you realized at one point you were sort of a math person, doing numbers and science and periodic table, and then you turned a corner somehow and you ended up in this more esoteric part of the job? Or was it such a gradual change?
It was definitely a gradual change, and it wasn't quite so intentional either. So intellectually, my interests have definitely gone from what drives me vocationally is I sort of wanted to learn about the universe and how everything works. And when I was younger, sort of math and the basic sciences were kind of appealing for that, because you learn about the building blocks and sort of physically how everything comes together. Today, I'm sort of more interested in the psychology and sociology of how do more complex systems like people get along with each other and interact with each other. And so it turns out that law is a really good field to be in, to sort of observe that and study it. But I didn't get into it because of that. I got into it because of this. I was a scientist who had sort of run through all the science jobs and found that I didn't like any of them, and found this one that seemed to hit the sweet spot for me. So I got into it for a different reason, but it also gets that sweet spot of wanting to sort of understand how people work.
Yeah.
I
want to ask about another thing that we have in common, which is your dad. And for the listeners who don't know, Dave's dad was a public school teacher in the town where we lived. And I would have known your dad before I knew you.
Yes.
Because actually we didn't meet till 6th grade, but your dad was my 5th grade art teacher.
Right.
And so Dave is the son of a art teacher, and I don't know, your parents always struck me as they were almost sort of like hippies. Or at least they sort of looked that way compared to the parents that I knew.
Maybe the Yooper version.
Yeah, they were kind of like backwoods Yooper hippies, but they were also like...
They had art in their house that they'd made.
And guns and axes and stuff like that. So that's the Yooper version.
But there was also art.
Yeah, it was amazing. And so actually I love drawing and visual art, and actually your dad taught me how to draw with a vanishing point. You know what I'm talking about?
I do.
And that was one of the things that I learned that just sort of blew my mind as a young visual artist, and I thought that was so cool. And actually, in my mind right now, I can remember the pictures in 5th grade that I drew using Vanishing Point that your dad helped me to do. Well, then, of course, then you and I met in 6th grade when I came to the other school. And then your dad was teaching at the high school. And I did. I think I had your dad for computers in those days. But he was also teaching art for a period of time for high school students, right?
Yes.
And and I actually spent lots of time with you and your dad painting the mural and in the high school. So Dave's dad coordinated a bunch of volunteer high school kids to stick around after school to paint gigantic, humongous murals on the walls of the English classroom and in the cafeteria. And so Dave and myself and other friends of ours would stick around and paint for hours and hours and hours after school and just make art together. And like your dad was kind of like, who was doing that? I mean, he was kind of an extraordinary character that he really gave young artistic kids a chance to do special things that were out of the norm and get to do some pretty cool stuff. And he had a kiln, I remember. Didn't you have a kiln at your house?
Yeah, potter's wheel and a kiln in the house. So I could do the spinning and make the pots.
That's so cool. So to talk about that, were you aware that your dad was kind of this artsy-fartsy sort of dude who was doing all this stuff? What was that like?
So growing up in the household was great because we had just every art supply imaginable in the house. We had the potter's wheel and the kiln, so I was working with clay as a little kid. We had silly putty and stuff like that too, and Play-Doh, but then I could go down and actually, do the real thing. But everything you can imagine, every kind of marker, colored pencil, gigantic pieces of paper.
And he was quite good.
He was an excellent artist.
Yeah. Did he have a favorite medium? Was he primarily like a potter or something?
Yeah, ceramics. Mm-hmm. And he sold professionally on the side some of his work. But yeah, so it was great growing up in a household that sort of encouraged artistic creativity.
Yep.
I think that sort of helped every aspect of my life, even though I kind of tracked more math and science.
Yeah. It's funny because you and your brother, the two children in the family, kind of turned out to be sort of techie people.
Yep.
But your house was not. I guess you were one of the first people or families I knew who was sort of Mac loyal.
Yeah, we were an Apple family very, very early on.
Very early on.
Early adopters.
Yeah. So I guess you were, even though your dad was artsy and your mom was, that they were sort of in the woods in that beautiful house, they were still sort of technological too.
Well, so my dad was actually a combo of the two. So while he was an art teacher and had art as his teaching major in college, he had actually started off as a civil engineer training and was really a math guy as well.
Yeah.
So sort of both sides of that were very much encouraged.
How rare to have, I don't know, is that rare? It seems kind of rare.
I think society thinks it's rare, but I think there's a whole lot more people than you'd imagine, or some would imagine, who
in the arts who are
mathematically inclined and also visual artists or creative like that. They sort of say, well, either you're creative and artistic or you're a math person, instead of realizing that there's lots of people who can do both.
Yeah, and then in fact I think there's this view that there's two different groups, and I think it's tremendously overlapping circles. A lot of the scientists I know are artists of some type or another.
Wow.
Writers, painters, musicians.
I think I'm still so sheltered from the UP. Listeners, if you're listening to this podcast, Dave and I are from a small town in Upper Michigan, which is isolated and kind of out in the woods. And I don't think I knew any adults, especially like a dad of one of my friends who was an artist. Can you think of anybody else who was an artist?
Well, yeah, just because my dad was an artist, he had some art friends.
He did. Because I can't, your dad was I remember, getting to know him and thinking, man, I don't know a lot of other dads of my peers who are anything quite like that. So I don't know, it made a big impression on me anyway. I thought it was really cool. Well, then, of course, even though you were hanging out with Dawn and people like that at the Science Olympics, you were also quite artistic as a teenager yourself. And that's, for those of you listening as well, Dave and I even played a lot of music together, wrote lots of songs together, made recordings. The first time I ever played in a rock band, Dave was playing in the band. And that was, I guess Mr. Richards was also sort of an artistic...
Yeah, he was a physics chemistry teacher.
He was a science guy who was also way into art and music. So Dave and I would stick around after school on Thursdays and go to the band room where our chemistry teacher would lead us in classic rock band practice. And so the first time I ever played with a drummer and played electric guitar, it was you and me and Mr. Richards on guitar and some random selection of drummers.
Yep.
So what?
Isn't that how?
And then you made movies,
Yep.
and you made
Not good ones.
all sorts of art. So I don't know. Talk about that a little bit. It seems like that was a big part of your development.
Well, I definitely grew up around art stuff, and it was encouraged, and I've always enjoyed it. So I would say, other than a few gaps in my life, I've always done something artistic. Mm-hmm. Even to this day, I'm doing writing right now more than anything else, but I still do some music stuff. But those two have always gone hand in hand. And I think they do go hand in hand. I mean, one of the kind of really interesting things career-wise where I work with sort of scientists and musicians and interact with lots of creative people is the act of creativity is the same from everything I can see between science and sort of the traditional arts. I don't see a difference. They map tremendously similarly. In all the different flavors, right? There's the sort of the out-of-the-box thinking. You see that in both of them. And I think a lot of people don't realize this with the sciences because most people's experience with the sciences is sort of what they had in high school and college, maybe. Mm-hmm. And that's a lot of just memorization of facts. Once you get to the next step, it's all about creative thinking and problem solving. And so a lot of people don't know that happens. And it's the same mental things you do when you're thinking of a new song or artwork or writing a book is what you're doing when you're solving science problems.
Don, what do you think is happening developmentally in a household like the Casimir household, or with science and art and opportunities to explore?
Well, I think you probably have a more networked corpus callosum than most. I'm totally serious. You know what I'm talking about?
I do.
Yeah. Do you think that?
Well, so
is that a possibility?
Have you had it? On the science side, I'm really an empiricist. So I'll have to say that there's reasons to think that may be true, but the proof will be in the pudding. we'll have to do a functional MRI to see if that's true.
All right, we can do that.
Weren't you just saying, Don, there's about 25 MRI machines within a few blocks?
Between Highway 62 and 494, yes. So, you can edit that out.
No, that's good.
So anyway.
Oh.
The fact that they're not separate, that they're integrated, that the brain is so integrated, and I think, I don't know, in the last 10 or 20 years, people are so used to sort of saying, oh, I'm right-brained or I'm left-brained, as if there's this huge dichotomy in life.
And the science has shown that doesn't even exist.
Right. But that it's sort of one of those, maybe one study somewhere had, the network is more extensive in the left frontal lobe for this versus that, and then that's then the science journalism people reported that, and then it got put on Good Morning America. So our brains have to be integrated. If they aren't, it's a disaster, and it's seen as an injured brain. And so the fact that the hemispheres do communicate, and that you need so many different parts of the brain to do so many complex tasks. So I would say you just had a lot of experiences that helped shape more extensive connections, both in your frontal lobe and then in the more sort of aesthetic parts, and probably in language, given that a lot of what you did was writing and songwriting and movie production, things like that. So that's what I think.
Well, and working kind of across these fields too, I kind of categorize things differently. A lot of people might say there's sort of the aesthetic arts and then the sort of the creative aspects of inventing. And I think in many ways they share more things in common, that you can take a piece of the art and a piece of the science and put them together, and they'll share more things in common than sort of another thing that's over on the art side or a different part of the science. And by that, I mean, there's sort of different types of creativity or creation that comes out, or invention. And just to give an example, some people are out-of-the-box thinkers. In art, that might mean, we end up with I Am the Walrus. Although maybe that involves some LSD. But, on the creativity side, it might mean I thought of using a virus to attack cancer instead of small chemicals. It's this totally out of the box thinking, and those two are very similar. But then there's other creation, both on the art side and the invention side, that might not be out of the box at all. It might just be really rigorous skill gaining, right? The masterful guitarist who's just so skilled that they can perform something that might not be at all out of the box, but is aesthetically pleasing to listen to because it's so amazing that they're technically competent. And you see the same thing on the scientists. Someone will get so good at a technique, they'll be the best in the world that they can invent something that never got invented before. And they're not being out of the box thinkers. They just took something to a level that no one got to before and were able to either find something or create something because of that.
Wow.
And so I would put that artist and that scientist in a bucket together and say that the way they create is more similar to each other than that other category where there's another artist and a scientist in the same bucket, in two different worlds.
Well, that's sort of the Thomas Jefferson, 1% perspiration, or 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration of just the really, really hard work every single day, working at your field and trying to get better.
Do you think artists and musicians consciously think of that process? Like, let's say before they get going on a new project, or does it just happen subconsciously and it just reveals itself? Or do you think there's some people who sit down and think, I'm going to do tons of hard work in the technical realm, and I'm going to get myself to a level of excellence where I'm going to break through to a whole new plane, where I'm going to gamble that there will be a creative moment up ahead. But I don't know what that's going to be, and I don't know how it's going to reveal itself. But I'm just going to immerse in the technical, trusting that something is going to blossom once I reach these extraordinary heights of proficiency.
So I think people are in each of those categories and along every continuum in between each of those categories, and not just on the musician artist side, but also on the sort of inventor, scientist, creator side, engineer.
Yeah.
It's all those. Some people are a combination of them. Some of them are in one bucket or another, and they feed off of each other, right? So, my own creation for music. Rarely do I get a fully formed idea in my head. It almost never happens. Maybe more on the writing side, but not on sort of music or any sort of drawing or painting. Those come from sort of noodling around. And if you have more technical proficiency at something, you're a better noodler. You have more noodles you can sort of explore.
Yeah.
The pasta is of higher quality.
It is, and you can look at different forms of pasta and combinations of pasta, right? They interact with each other as well. And so for me personally, I'm not a good technician in anything musically, but the better I've gotten at any instrument, I think the more creative I've been able to be in songwriting with that instrument, because my noodling is more diverse.
Yeah.
And I can sort of hear things. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And part of that was being able to actually physically do that.
What's weird about music specifically is we can actually identify individual, real people who you could sort of say are the best in the world at their particular thing. So I've been thinking in this conversation a lot about like Bela Fleck, who's the banjo player, who is probably the greatest banjo player on the face of the earth and the best banjo player that's ever lived. And no one would argue that. And he would probably own up to it in a humble sort of nice way. And here's somebody who seems to be making deliberate choices to dedicate his life to technical excellence, like just the way he's practicing and opening his mind to new influences and traveling the world. And he's playing Bach and he's playing African folk music and he's playing bluegrass and he's and so he actually has ascended to that kind of level. And I mean, do people do that in the sciences too?
They do.
Where they say, I'm going to be, well, I suppose in medicines, they say, I'm going to be the greatest heart surgeon in the world. Or
and when you really look at sort of like the inventors, a lot of sort of clinical physicians who do surgeries, some of them are inventors, no doubt about it, but a lot of them are not. You generally don't know about inventors these days. The old days, they used to be a bit more famous.
Right, yeah.
You ask people to name a living scientist, research scientist, and almost no one can name one anymore.
Yeah. Do you think people could name Thomas Edison back in the day? He was like a celebrity?
Yes. Yeah. Scientists were more celebrities back in the day.
Wow.
But you'd see exactly the same thing, which is the very best people become super skilled, and usually that means super knowledgeable. They learn everything in the field, but then they go and explore side fields, and they go to all the meetings, and they talk to other people. I mean, one of the things that's, when you look at the biology of creativity, and people have studied where does creativity come from, and you look at sort of ancient human history, and there were periods where we were not a creative species.
Yeah.
It looks like one of the big trigger points for creativity was community. We became a creative species when community happened and people shared ideas and visited other people and sort of, it's hard to think out of the box if you only know one box. If you've been introduced to other boxes, it's easier to step out of not just those boxes. The more boxes you've seen, the more you can operate in each of them and step out of all of them.
Relational aspect to having a breakthrough.
Yeah, and you definitely see it with scientists. The best creators are multidisciplinary, really throw themselves into it and become masters of their techniques and their knowledge.
Wow.
And you see everything. So, some artists get their creativity, I'd say unfortunately, but from substances.
Yeah.
You see that with inventors too. There's a Nobel Prize winning biochemist who alleges to have come up with his invention on an LSD trip driving up the mountain.
Oh. Yeah, well, if it's the same process, I mean, it could be inspired in similar ways, whether you're, whether it's...
I don't encourage anyone to do that.
So what are the, when they look at the regions, what are the regions?
What are...
Brain, like if you are doing a functional MRI, what areas are more active?
Okay, let's see if I remember my brain. So, the frontal lobe is obviously a critical initiating point for creative thought.
And executive functioning, among other things, yes?
So my brain anatomy is a little rusty. What's the little bits down more on the side?
This is temporal, parietal,
and
the
temporal lobes, which have a lot of our language capacity,
yes,
are also critical for executing on the creativity. And then there's been studies that have shown you need sort of some limbic kick to it. It's really a lot of the brain working together to operate different aspects to pull together. So the idea forms in sort of one space, maybe stimulated by other parts of the brain, but the execution of it requires other brain parts.
We've talked with some of the other creatives appearing on the podcast about dreams.
Yeah.
And do you get an idea for a song, for a painting, etc. in a dream? And I'm wondering if you've heard people in the sciences, in the harder sciences, saying that inspiration or a solution or another way to try something came to them while they were sleeping, when all of those consolidations of memories and what went through the day. I mean, sleep is such a restorative, creative act.
Yes.
And that we're learning more about. Do you have any stories that you've heard of scientists who've had, or maybe you've had a solution, an angle to a case or something about a patent that came to you in sleep?
So kind of three versions of that. So yes, I've heard people report that they've dreamed something that led to assist their discovery. Personally, I haven't had that in terms of an actual invention, but I've had it 1 degree separated, which is to say, when I was learning science, like really rigorously learning the facts, what I found is as I got more advanced, individual fact memorization wasn't so much how you learn science. What you end up doing is having this scaffold in your brain of how the universe works, with a lot of open, empty spaces. And understanding what you don't know is more important than understanding what you do know. But when you have the scaffold built and then you learn something, you learn where to attach that to the scaffold, what its relationships are with the things next to it. And the more you add to that scaffold, the more you see the interconnections and the more it's easier to fill in the blanks. So a good sort of creative scientific thinker has a scaffold in their mind. And without doubt, the scaffolds form better after restful sleep. And presumably dreams and the various things that are happening are doing that. I always found that I was most efficient at, if I needed to learn something quickly or solve a complex problem, it was best if I hit it at night and hit it hard for multiple hours and then had a good night's sleep, and like a true good night's sleep. Don't if I needed to do something the next day, it wasn't stay up all night and study it. It's stay up until a reasonable hour, get a full night's sleep, and the next day the pieces snapped together and they were there.
This reminds me of when we were in high school. You can correct me if I've got the details wrong, but didn't you calculate the amount of sleep that you felt like was good for you at the time, and then map out your day according to like allowing for lots of time to read? And so like, wouldn't you like read Newsweek or Time or something in the evenings and then have your sleep blocked off in a real deliberate sort of way? Does that sound familiar?
It does, and I still do that.
Oh, you gotta let us know what's the system, like what's the breakdown of the time frame.
Well, so it's different for every person, right? You have to find your spots. I call it more than anything energy management these days.
Yeah. And tell us, when did you start this? Was this your own idea, or did you hear someone?
I'm sure it wasn't. It's completely independent. But I have been doing this to varying degrees since I was a kid.
Yeah, you were 15 or something in doing this.
And I have it honed to a tight science now for my own personal life.
So what does it look like?
Oh, it'd be embarrassing to say it. Maybe off mic. Because speaking of out of the box, it's a bit out of the box.
But you've got it down to a science. It works. It's a system that totally works.
And the hardest part of it was energy management. So what I do, kind of each new year, I would do the New Year's resolutions. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people will do 2. Like, I'm going to lose weight this year or exercise more. Mm-hmm. I do more than 2. Like this year, I have 43 of them.
And you write it down?
I do.
It helps. They always say to write whatever your vision is, to write it down.
And I've gotten really good at it. And this year's been my best one yet. And the thing I've realized more than anything is I actually had to create resolutions that were about energy management to allow the other ones to actually work out well. Which means, giving myself breaks, knowing my own limits, shifting with age, allotting for sickness. This sounds like I'm sort of a robot, but
no, you sound like an astronaut going to Mars.
It's much more organic than that. But sorry, one last little point on the sleep part. There have been biological studies done on creativity, quite a few of them, and one of the things that's, I think, pretty clearly understood as probably a fact at this point, or a very serious theory, is sleep is a critical requirement to creativity. If you take out sleep or you damage parts of the brain that benefit from sleep, you lose creativity.
It seems to me that you have always had a very deliberate way of living. Like your daily life is, there's not a lot of willy-nilly going on. You know what I mean? Is that true?
Yes and no. So for the stuff that needs to get done, I definitely blocked off time to make sure it got done. But I guess when I was younger, like high school, I didn't leave a lot of time for willy-nilly other than sort of spontaneous social activities with friends and stuff. But I actually now make sure I have willy-nilly time.
And that's probably ultimately helpful,
it is.
Right? To
it
creativity
is.
And thinking and
yes.
enjoyment.
Well, I think, you're probably one of the most deliberate people that I've ever known. And it's certainly like your career has sort of unfolded, and even like your house and, just your whole presence has a deliberate thing about it that I think is really cool. And I wonder do you ever think your life itself is like a science experiment or like an art project?
Oh, it totally is. Because
you're making decisions that are a little bit, I say, more deliberate than the average bear.
Yeah, that's fair to say.
And so I think there's even there's a creativity and an expression in that kind of, even the mundane stuff, from the way you cook breakfast to the way you bought your house, or
agreed
the way you own a car.
And I experiment with these things.
Yeah,
like a scientist
does.
It's
hypothesis testing,
but also like an artist.
Yeah, totally. I was going to say, because it's like it's like a science experiment, but it's also like an art project.
Yeah.
Like the way most people just live their life to get through the day and make sure did I eat? Did I take a shower? Did I, they're not consciously like building a grand Lego castle of their life. But, you seem to be doing a little bit more of that.
Yes, I definitely am. And part of it is, in terms of just energy management, is I don't have children, which frees me up energy-wise to be able to do that.
Yeah,
I think
that's a huge thing. Less
people are having children than they used to in the old days, but those who have kids, I don't think it's actually that it'd be very difficult to pull it off.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, I also, this reminds me of when we were teenagers. You were one of the first people I ever knew who played Dungeons and Dragons.
Right.
And who also knew a lot about Star Trek.
Yep.
And I really liked, and Star Wars, and I was into that sort of thing, although I didn't know anything about Dungeons and Dragons. But I wonder, you were, are those ways that people experiment with living? like Star Trek is a parable for how people can, like the Federation of Planets, how they can manage the way they live, how they use science, how they express themselves, that sort of thing. And then Dungeons and Dragons is a way for people to practice like a virtual life apart from their normal, to practice a different kind of living. I don't know. How did that influence you, do you think, those kind of experiences as a kid?
I would say not much. In that those are tools that I think people can have. So one of the nice things with Star Trek is, especially some of the newer, like the Next Generation series, is really present sort of a kind of a slightly utopian model for where we might go if the better parts of ourselves triumphed.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a nice model to think about where we might be able to go. Mm-hmm. But back in the old days, I think sort of those shows and games were just regular cultural influences like anything else.
What was appealing about them to you? Because there weren't that many people into it in our little town.
Yeah, I mean, I guess culturally, where we grew up, it wasn't popular. Well, maybe it wasn't anywhere back in those days to be sort of a nerd.
Yeah, but if you had gone to school in Naperville, Illinois, there would have been 100 kids like you
that's true.
Who you could have gone to the Dungeons and Dragons club with after school. But
right.
in our town, there was only 5 of you.
Yeah.
There wasn't very many. And it was you and your brother and a couple other people.
You try to hide it a bit and not acknowledge it, or swing an axe now and then to sort of give yourself some
credibility,
some cred back. But today I'm an unapologetic nerd, so I have no issue with it. But so what's interesting about that though is I think one of the limitations was just the media back then wasn't as good to fully explore, but it's much better today. So if you look at sort of some of the complex gaming systems that are out there now that are in the fantasy sci-fi genres, they allow communities and lots of social interactions where people can experiment with alternative versions of themselves. And I think that's produced both good and bad. If you look at a lot of those, at least sort of the younger people who are in there, the under 18s, have largely created a cesspool. But maybe that's good for that actually might be good for their development as well. But it's a chance to
let their ugly flag fly.
Yeah. It's probably too early, and I don't know that there's been good studies done on it yet. Maybe there has. I haven't read them, but it'll be really interesting to look back at it and see if it has a net benefit. And I suspect it will.
Yeah. Huh.
That's helpful.
Are you still you still play video games and know about video games, don't you?
I do. Not so much as I used to, but I do play occasionally, yes.
Are they the ones that are connected online with other people in other places?
I'm not currently playing any of those, but I have, and somewhat seriously in like the last decade.
Is that something in the biotech world that other scientists do?
I would say scientists do it more frequently than the average population. Yeah. Absolutely.
Well,
but I will say, in the communities I played in, it was a pretty good mix of lots of different folks. I saw, lots of teachers, lots of police officers, lots of soldiers. There's lots of military people playing those games.
Yeah. Actually, in those military documentaries, oftentimes that's what the soldiers are doing when they're in the tent, like in between assignments or something.
But it was everyone. It's probably male-dominated still, without doubt, but there's also a lot of women participating, ranging from everyone you can think of. A lot of stay-at-home moms are playing those games.
Yeah, wow. One of the reasons that Dave is here on Creativity Drill is, well, we're at a point in the podcast show where it's becoming a Mobius strip, where people who are on the show as the guest have actually started out as a listener to the show. And, that's because now there's actually some episodes sitting online. And, that's a dynamic of this kind of conversation that I didn't expect. But you, when we were communicating online, when you mentioned that you'd be available, it was just fun to hear that people are interested in these topics. And so as a listener, before you came on the show, when you heard us talking to other creative types, obviously you were feeling a resonance to this is something that you had something to contribute. And so what would you say, what were you motivated by for the creative people listening? Because you've got a perspective on it that most creatives don't have.
Yeah, I guess a couple of different things. So, just my immediate interest in the podcast was, I mentioned earlier, I think that one of my the things that makes my life happy is sort of learning about everything in the universe. And this was a topic that I hadn't heard anyone talking about before. I mean, obviously people have. You look around and there's lots of academic work on this, but so it was just super interesting. Like this is the type of thing, if it hadn't been your podcast, but like an NPR bit or a bit on Nova or something, I would have like been latched on like, ooh, creativity. Yeah. Like that's a topic I didn't think about too much. Yeah. But then I realized I do think about it all the time. It's everything I do in my career is working with creative people. Yeah. I just didn't think about talking about it or thinking about it so overtly.
And I think it's that same not thinking about it is happening in reverse, where people who are sitting in their studios making oil paintings or writing a screenplay or on tour singing songs don't think about how much they depend on advocates for creatives like yourself, because you're in the position of representing and protecting and helping and whatever the creative people out in the world, but we don't consider in daily practice we don't consciously think about all these people who are working on our behalf or advocating for us, let's say on the other side of the glass, so to speak.
It's kind of an invisible layer, and that's kind of a cultural thing. It's intellectual property, I think, is a topic that all creatives, whether it's artists, scientists, ought to learn at least some basic levels about.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. So what do you think musicians and painters and authors or whoever are obligated to learn about to either protect themselves or enhance their own creative work, or to just be more professional or more effective, or as someone on the other side of the glass, so to speak? Like what would your advice be to our listeners who are creatives?
So I think culturally a lot of creatives, and you can affirm this or if I'm over-exaggerating this point, are afraid of the topic and actively distance themselves from it. They don't want to have anything to do with legal stuff.
Yeah. Or business stuff. They hate business. And, I mean, that's been my experience. They just hate, and they hate PR and press, and they they almost get nauseated, like physically sick.
So I guess the message I would have, and why this is a topic where people ought to learn basic level information on it, if nothing else, like read the Wikipedia page on copyright, for example, if you're a creative at a minimum. Yep. But I would, this is the way I think, but block out a day every year to sort of keep up on what's going on in copyright if you're a creative type, because you can really get yourself into trouble if you make a mistake. And it's also, I think, important to learn how it's there to assist one's career.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, all these things are for the benefit of the artist. They're not a enemy. Like, business is not the enemy of the artist, and the law is not the enemy of the artist. They are there to. It's a neutral. It's either a neutral thing or a helpful thing.
Yeah, and especially for creatives, I'd say one sort of global bad experience you might hear from people is the system's sort of geared against them. And I think that is true to a degree, but the reason for that is lack of participation in it. You always have sort of balancing acts. There's a $10 come in, they're going to get distributed somewhere amongst the creative distributor, the producer, there's a whole bunch of people with their hats out for that money. And it's probably fair to say maybe too much of that money is not ending up in the artist's hands. Especially in the music side, for writers in particular, less so than performers. They're having less of that money in their hands than ever before. Maybe that'll change. We'll have to see how it pans out. But the reason for that is lack of participation. The rules get changed by Congress or by court cases. And those things happen now, obviously, by lobbying and a lot of the political stuff, which, big moneyed interests are always going to have a hand on that. But if there's a lot of voices speaking loudly on the other side, it will shift the pendulum back the other way. To speak loudly, speaking loudly is not enough. Speaking loudly and intelligently and making good points will shift it the other way. Too many people being afraid of these topics squelches that voice. So I think the artist's voice is underrepresented as it pertains to intellectual property laws. And that affects the pocketbooks. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. And it's interesting that if you're an artist, the more successful you become, the more these things matter.
Yes.
So if you're a hobbyist and you're doing, making one piece of art a year, big deal. But if all of a sudden you start having kind of a sizable income, or wow, imagine if all of a sudden you think, I'm going to quit my day job and become an artist full time, then the more successful you get, it's just this incremental thing matching, like the value of the legal ramifications and the business ramifications just matter more and more and more. And I always think to myself, like, even though I'm independent as an artist, and even though I'm, sort of an unknown quantity, sort of on the national scene, or I'm an indie person, I always try to behave and put into practice things that the people who are 10 rungs higher than me do. And I find that if you start to behave like the people way up the ladder above you behave, then before you know it, you're all of a sudden way more professional and you have way more clout, and therefore you have more artistic opportunity,
right? And
you have more influence, and you have a bigger audience.
And more freedom, because you're probably paying more attention to the contracts you're signing.
Yeah. So it's funny how it's like one feeds the other in both directions. And so, artistic people can make a conscious decision, I'm going to start behaving more professionally. And it's funny, maybe we can have Jake Armerding on. Jake is a songwriter who I did a tour with a while ago. We were talking in the car, and this is just a super, super basic thing, but it's just an example where he told me that one day he decided, I'm going to dress better. I'm going to start dressing like a professional on stage. And I'm not going to just wear street clothes. I'm going to dress like a real performer. And he raised the bar on himself and noticed the audience gave him more attention not attention, but more credibility, and were there with him in a more legitimate way because he raised the bar on his own practice as an artist.
Yep.
And it sounds so surfacey, like, oh, it's just how you look, or it's just but really that stuff actually trickles down to reality. And it's true with legal issues, and it's true with business issues. And, so if you're an artist listening to this show, you could ask yourself, what could you do to become more knowledgeable, to let your voice be heard in your own community as an artist regarding your rights, your legal rights, and your rights as a creator, and the ownership of the work that you're making, and how can you give yourself the credibility that you deserve? Because hey, you made great stuff. Your art is beautiful, and it's worthy of being taken seriously and being protected. And you're a legitimate artist. You're a legitimate person, and you have dignity and deserve to be protected and taken seriously.
There's also a second layer that people ought to be aware of as creatives. So the one layer we just talked about is getting value out of the intellectual property that you create.
Yeah.
There's a second layer to intellectual property law that is also, I think, maybe even more important for people to be informed about, is staying out of trouble, which is not violating other people's intellectual property. Because also while you're climbing that ladder, you are going to encounter enemies. It's just the world of business. And when your art becomes a business, if you're lucky, you'll avoid the enemies, but will you make it through a whole life without a car crash or running off into the ditch? Maybe if you're lucky, but most people have at least one or two incidents. Yeah, you will as a creative as well as you're climbing the ladder. Yep. If you get yourself in trouble, it can be career crushing. And that is to say, if you're Robin Thicke and you end up copying a Marvin Gaye song and you can afford to pay $7 million, that's great. If you can't afford to pay the $7 million, you're in trouble. Yeah. And, just an example, since we're in Minnesota here, the record labels a number of years back decided to sue just sort of people on the street for online posting of songs. Yep. And they basically offered cheap settlements to everyone, relatively cheap. I mean, it's like $5,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. Yep. And people really had to take those. Yep. And they did. Yep. There's a woman in Minnesota who chose not to. And she ended up in the courts for many, many years. It went up and down through various appeals. At various points, she was found guilty and owed between $300,000 and like $1.5 million.
Yes, I remember this.
The final decision came down from an appellate court, and the U.S. Supreme Court decided they weren't going to handle it. She ended up owing $300,000.
Yeah.
This is someone...
She's just a civilian, like a normal a normal person listening to music. And it was file sharing or something.
File sharing. And so that's a life-crushing event.
Yeah.
That's an extreme example, but if you make enemies or that's a good idea not to burn bridges, or have competitors out there or business partners where a relationship falls apart and you don't have your intellectual property done right, including avoiding problems with other stuff, you may find yourself in court in an economically crushing situation where it could bankrupt you.
Right.
So keeping your hands clean is another reason why basic levels of knowledge is important.
Wow, that's so practical. And for those of you listening, I mean, my gosh, all you have to do is read a book or check out a Wikipedia page about your favorite musician from the past, from the 70s, for example.
There's great online lectures.
And you will see...
to copyright, free.
Oh, you will see, people running into enemies who stole their publishing, screwed them over in their label business, whatever. And that's just in the music business, but I'm sure it happens in visual arts, and I know it happens in film with actors and screenwriters. And isn't that weird? Like, yes, you can do things to accelerate your own success and your own career, but the farther you go, the more dangerous it gets.
It does.
Because you're right, you're meeting more people, you're collaborating. The bigger you get, the more there's other people with their fingers in the income department.
And it doesn't take much knowledge to get things right.
Yeah, to protect yourself.
Yeah.
You can, if you just learn a little bit, you can make wise decisions.
At a minimum, you know what questions to ask of someone else when you need help.
Yeah. Yep.
Are you aware, is there already an Intellectual Property Awareness Day?
There isn't. Maybe we could start one of those.
Maybe we could start one, yes.
I don't think it'll be that popular.
Where you just take the day off and you just learn about it on that one day, and then you can, go back to your art the next day. But
I don't know if you've looked at there's a website that gives a calendar of what all the various days are.
Oh, yes.
And so each day has like 5 or 6 days. But everyone gets intellectual property. Let's say there's 6 other things on that day. It's going to be 7th.
Yeah.
Cheese day is the same day.
Pancakes.
So even if we create it, it's probably not going to get much attention.
Yeah.
Oh, the practical advice on this podcast is just extraordinary. It's just amazing. Oh, man, no one can say that we're just blathering.
Right. There's some educational content here.
We were just talking about High School Bowl, which was the Upper Michigan Public Television quiz show. Was it weekly?
Yeah, for a while it runs weekly. Yeah,
and it pitted the nerdiest kids in each school against one another,
or
who are also athletic and charming.
The awesomest kids.
And then, what was the prize? What if you won?
It was a scholarship for the school to go to Northern Michigan University.
Oh,
so
even for the local college nearby.
But who got the scholarship?
So the school then awarded it to whoever it made sense.
So you could win that for the school and then not get it.
Correct.
Okay, that doesn't seem quite aligned.
That actually happened.
Did it?
Yes. My junior year, we won the second place scholarship, and it went to someone else.
Well, that doesn't seem quite fair.
That's okay.
Oh well. Prelude to the world not being fair.
What was your high school bowl experience like? Because I remember you memorizing pi to an incredibly long decimal point degree.
So that wasn't really so much for high school bowl, but just for street cred as a nerd. It was a really fun experience, but kind of nerve wracking because it was aired on public television, the local public television station. It was their top rated program. So
wow,
a lot of people watched it. And
yeah.
So awkward. Not necessarily a highly confident high school student gets nervous about such things. But the experience was great. And the funny secret I had, anyone who watched those old episodes thought I was a master of literature. Because what I noticed is they asked lots of literature questions, and the host was a English professor. And so I thought, if we're going to get these right, someone's going to have to learn this stuff. And all I did was I wrote a little computer program that had a database of book names and a database of authors, and then it would randomly spiral them out, and I'd have to guess one versus the other. It would give me a book, and I'd guess the author. It would give me the author, I'd guess the book, and I just ran through those until I had them all memorized. And so these literature questions would come up, and I'd buzz in really early because they'd just name some obscure book from like a Russian author, and I'd make that association for my little video game I wrote, answer right away, and the host really loved me because he thought I was like a literature guy.
What was his name? Dave something?
Dave Goldsmith. And
Dave
I'd
Goldsmith.
never read a single one of those books. I had no idea what they were about.
What happened to Dave Goldsmith?
He actually died from cancer, I believe.
I think I remember that. Well, didn't you also memorize all the presidents and their vice presidents and their years?
I just remember it. And my favorite book back then was the Almanac. You remember they'd have those big fat almanacs with all this sort of knowledge.
The Farmer's Almanac?
No, it was like I forget who was the publisher on
Almanac.
it, but it was
Oh,
just
the
like
World
a
Almanac.
list of everything.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that was at the World Almanac. So I'd memorize all sorts of things in there.
Yeah, you had a lot of history dates, and I always thought that was quite amazing. And did you put a lot of time into that?
I did.
You were
Well, I enjoyed it though. Like
it was fun.
I love learning stuff. So
Yeah.
It was a good fit. So you would have answered lots of questions about well-known authors, etc. But one of the things that's part of the Dave Casimir experience is that you've actually met the historical figure, but I can't remember if it's Watson or Crick, one of the prize-winning scientists who discovered the structure of DNA.
Watson was on the UW campus giving a talk.
Okay, so you sat with him at a talk. Okay, so are there other scientists you've met that have been awesome, or scientists you would like to meet?
So Watson, I think he's still alive, and I don't mind saying this because I'm highly confident of this view, is kind of a jerk as a human being. And it's well documented. Google him and you'll see some recent shenanigans.
WatsonIsAJerk.com.
That
Or like a
site
meme
probably
or something.
exists. But I met Glenn Seaborg at...
Oh, from Ishpeming.
Yes. He was very, very old and shaky at the time, but he discovered some elements from the periodic table.
Yes, he has a Nobel Prize, I think.
Yes. So I met sort of...
How old were you when you met Glenn Seaborg?
I would have been 16 or 17.
Yeah, because he died in the 80s.
Shortly thereafter, I think. Yeah.
Wow, it's funny. Our town, Ishpeming, Michigan, has produced some unusual characters, but Glenn Seaborg is definitely the science rock star of Ishpeming.
So I've worked with a number of Nobel Prize winners, either sort of for or against them on various cases I've worked on. So they're sort of famous in the field, but like I said, no one knows any sort of contemporary scientists.
Do they have an attitude or a kind of a gravitas to them?
It's a total mix. Some are the humblest, nicest people you'd ever meet, and some are raging narcissists.
What's the quality of, just think of all the smart, brilliant people you get to work with on a regular basis. What's going on with them? Like, what kind of qualities do they have?
Or what are the archetypes?
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. So curious, I would say, is number one. They're curious people. It's the full spectrum of sort of every personality in regular life. Obviously there's a filter where maybe some are selected for a little bit more than others. Lots of attention to detail, lots of curiosity, lots of focus. I'd say those are the things that match all the creative people I know. Like those are three of the most common characteristics.
So the fact that they are able to focus their attention.
Yes.
So that's interesting. I think that's a little bit tied to energy management that you were talking about earlier, because I've read some things about attention being one of our resources that's in increasing demand in all the things that we face in modern life today, and that if you have control of your own attention, that's really an asset that you bring into a lot of situations, that where you can focus your attention and what you can sort of let fall away to the sides.
Right.
We're developing some recurring stories here on this podcast. You got to tell the Bo Williman about energy management.
Oh,
Did you watch this House of Cards show?
I haven't. Everyone says it's great. I haven't
It's
watched
incredibly great.
but the writer was quoted in a quick article. Was it Vanity Fair?
Yeah.
Vanity Fair, and he said he finally asked for his own parking spot because he was spending 10 minutes a day looking for a parking spot. And when he added that up, he said, well, every week that's almost an hour that I could be writing that I'm looking for a parking space instead. So if I just have a parking spot, not because he had a huge ego to want a parking spot, but just he saw it all in terms of how many pages he could write.
Right.
So I saw that as an indicator of him saying, I want to be focusing my attention most of the time on doing this creative work instead of finding a parking spot.
Right.
Or he probably gets his groceries ordered or someone else buys his groceries, but he doesn't want to be spending his attention on going shopping for sort of the mundane aspects of life, but just being able to focus on what he wants to focus on. So do you encounter that in scientists and just sort of excellent attorneys in the field, that they're really in command of their attention?
So I think they're in command of their attention, but not many of them not in the scenario you just gave where it was effort to match that into their life cleanly. I think a lot of really effective people are focused to the detriment of the other aspects of their lives, but do great things. Most scientists know that's not true. Most creative types know, but a lot of the really high achievers maybe have some deficits in some other areas.
Well, both of you are science people and very deliberate livers. So what would you give artists encouragement to do in their own daily practice to increase focus and
up their energy management?
Up their energy management so that they can be the best artist that they can be, so their creativity can flourish. Like, what are some practical things?
So my first bit of advice is going to be exactly contrary to what you're looking for, but it's an important one, which I think is to say, don't look for other people's solutions to that problem, like the advice we might just give in the minute here, but find it what works for you, because everyone manages those things differently. And if you try to map someone else's solution onto your own life, it may or may not fit. Listen to other people, experiment with those things, but find your own thing that works. I think that's an important bit. But actually, the example you just gave earlier is a great one. Actually, look where you're spending your energy. Maybe spend a whole week just writing down, what do I do every day, every minute of every day. It's some labor to do that, but then go back and look at it and say, where did I get enough time for my creativity this week? No. Let's look where I spent my time. Where can I fix that? And for me, for my creative time, like if I'm trying to write, which is one of my New Year's resolutions, one of the 43 things is to actually produce some content that gets released this year. Unlike a lot of the other things I'm doing, that's not slotted in any time slot in any given day. That is left loose to have it occupy time where I have energy, and I've done other things to make sure I have energy generally, and then where I'm inspired to actually do that. I'm not going to force it. Now, not having a career in it, I don't have to force it. I know career creatives have to force it sometimes. I have the luxury of not having to. But I would say you also have to make sure you have enough open gaps that when you feel inspired, you can slot that into one of those open gaps rather than having to force it into a tiny, tight window. Have more windows open than you need.
How about collaboration? Are there any tricks or examples you've seen in the sciences or with the artistic people that you work with who are working with other people on a project? Are there ways to collaborate effectively without getting sick of the other person or killing each other?
Well, so the sick and killing part is, the reality of human relations. Hopefully not killing, but just collaboration I think is critical, especially if you're trying to expand into new areas. And that's both sort of inventing on the science side or, in my experience, the artistic side. Whenever you get a new instrument, right, I always say it comes with a couple songs built into it. Yeah. Right?
Totally.
Just the sound of it makes you think of some things you never thought of before.
Yeah.
Same thing in the sciences. You create a new environment, it sort of comes with some new ideas. But relationships are critical. It helps you, like I said earlier, think about other boxes that you can get into and then think outside of your own, theirs, and get into some new space. So definitely important, but in terms of energy management, it's really critical to manage those relationships so it's not destroying your energy.
Yeah. I was just watching this documentary about the band Kansas, which actually I just saw in Billboard magazine is in the top 100 on the charts. It's the first time they've been on the pop charts since 1987.
Wow. I just listened to The Wall on my drive here.
Yeah. Oh, and that's such a great song. But the documentary is called Miracles Out of Nowhere. It's a great documentary. And it talks about when, at the beginning of their career, when they were really prolific and making what everyone considers their classic material, they lived in a band house where all the 6 dudes lived in the same house, and their instruments were always set up, and they slept on floors, and they just played music together all the time, you know. And you hear about the Beatles, who went to Hamburg before they were ever signed to a label, and they slept on floors in the same apartment and just played all the time, and they produced all this great material. And at least in the rock and roll realm, what happens to so many bands is that their creativity starts to falter and their relationships start to falter when they get their own house, and one guy moves to New York and one guy moves to LA.
Sure.
And they send files to each other in Pro Tools, and they don't ever play in the same room together anymore. And of course there comes a point in everybody's life where you got to stop sleeping on the floor, and you can't, you might have a family, and those days eventually come to an end. But there's something magical and productive and beautifully artistic and effective about just getting with your collaborators and sleeping on the floor and just playing together all day and having nothing to do except it's almost like a beyond retreat.
Yep.
There's no distractions. And if you think REM, they were like that when they started. U2 were, these bands that created a body of work that was just undeniable. At the beginning, it was kind of this all for one for all, unified front and intimacy going on that was really effective. And it's hard to keep that going as your adult life goes along.
Well, I hadn't thought about that much, but so in the sciences, it's definitely the same case. Like if there's a hard problem that needs to be solved, it's almost always done with teamwork, and you get these extraordinary things where people may go home for the night, but these big breakthroughs that happen that you hear about, almost every one of them has a team of 5 or 6 or 8 people spending every waking hour together and using each other's energy to boost themselves up. That totally happens in the sciences as well.
Oh, like the Manhattan Project.
Exactly. And so that happens every day. Like people trying to cure cancer and working on complex computer security issue. That happens all the time, and you do get more creative and you get better results when people are doing that. There's no doubt about it. But what's interesting about this is I haven't heard of anyone sort of systematically thinking about ways of managing the human relationships and the time, energy amongst groups like that to get best long-term optimization out of that. And there's probably something to be done there, right? So that there's at least some sort of dogma that gets built up as you learn to do this, or someone's out there watching this and coaching it and saying, okay, you guys are doing really productive work, but you need a 2-hour timeout here because I've learned that if you don't take it, you're all going to kill each other next week.
Exactly. Yeah. I've been reading a lot of books and watching a lot of documentaries on classic rock albums of the past. And so I read about Fleetwood Mac when they made Rumors. And the engineer and producer of the record wrote the book about it, Ken Calais, who actually he favored something I wrote on Twitter. It was so exciting. I was like, oh my gosh, it's the Fleetwood Mac guy. Just liked something I said on Twitter. But what they did, instead of like working in LA with all of their pals, was they like rented a couple houses in the North Bay area, like in Sausalito. Sure. And they just holed up there, and they would come to the studio every day at noon and work till 10 or whatever. I mean, they had it was kind of like kids would do, where you're just all together all the time.
It's like camp.
Yeah, it was like camp. Or exactly, like going to camp or going on retreat. And most recently, I just watched this documentary about Peter Gabriel So album from 1985, which he made with Daniel Lanois as the producer. And Lanois agreed to do the album when he was pitched the idea. He said, I'll do it, but just so you know, I'm going to dedicate my entire life to you and this album. And it's going to be the only thing I do. And we are going to make a classic album that everyone is going to remember forever. And so he said, I'm going to move to where you are. And they had a house in the country in England that was there were none of their friends were around. The industry was not around. It was like way the heck out there. And there were cows in a farm field and a barn. And they set up the studio in the barn where the cows would come and look in the window. And all they did for a year was write and dissect and be creative and play and record and track. And both of them, the artist and the producer, were just saying it was just the sort of blissful. And of course, they had bumps in the road and difficult times, but ultimately it was like this extraordinarily creative time. And of course, it resulted in one of the greatest rock albums of the 80s and maybe of all time.
Yeah, I would say so.
And it's a fantastic, everybody, if you want to go on Amazon, you can, I think I bought mine for like $4. It's on DVD. It's a fantastic movie. Really great. If you like Peter Gabriel and Lanois, you'll just love it. But wow, what an example of, like, this is how to be creative. I mean, if you want to make art that is really gonna stand the test of time, that you can really be proud of, there are things you can do and choices you can make deliberately to set yourself up for success.
And I think that maps to the inventing creative world as well. Exactly the same.
Yeah.
Can I ask sort of an overlay on all this? And you've probably seen the data, and it has to do with age.
Okay.
And how that was happening when they were in their 20s or their 30s.
Yeah.
And when you see the invention curve, or when the scientists do their greatest work, and I've read books and said, well, they need to do it in their 20s and 30s where they're sort of most appealing for mating and things like that. Do you have a professional or personal or just a Dave opinion about age and people doing their best work in creative fields?
Yeah. So it varies by the field. So I'm not a professional mathematician or physicist, so I'm relying on other people's perspectives here for saying what I'm about to say for those fields. But there is a general feeling that people do their best work in those two fields in their 20s.
Physics and mathematics?
Math and physics, yeah. Okay. The most creative, the
breakthroughs.
The really big breakthroughs. In the life sciences, where I spend a lot of my time, so this is medical research, things like that, it's older people who do. Now, part of that is they become, the field is more complex. You have to know more facts. You have to associate more things. So part of that just requires more time. 18-year-old can't know enough. 22-year-old can't know enough to put the pieces together. So part of it's that. But a lot of the life sciences are not done individually like math and physics is. And obviously those are also done collaboratively as well. I'm not trying to imply they're not, but there's more collaboration in the biosciences, and so a lot of the best discoveries actually happen with people. They usually have two big breakthroughs. They have their young one when they're working in someone else's laboratory.
Oh, yeah.
And then they have their second one when they're running that laboratory 20 years later. And it's two different things. So I think it is probably, it appears that people are more creative in their 20s and 30s. But a lot of the best biosciences happen by 50 and 60 and 70-year-old managers herding the creative cats that are running around in their laboratory, putting the pieces together, making the connections. So it ends up being, if you look at the great life sciences discoveries, it's by a lot of older people.
Do you have
with younger people working with them?
Do you have a legacy kind of moment in your own career where in 20 years you look back and you'll say, that was the case or the decision or the move that I made that I will be remembered for?
So I don't think so, and I hope not.
Oh, why not?
I'm not interested in being remembered for my career.
Wow, why not?
I mean, if I did something wonderful, that'd be great, but I actually think if I'm going to make a notable contribution, and I don't really care to or not. I mean, I'd love to make a contribution that's helpful, but I don't care so much about being famous for it. It's going to be in the next phase of my life.
Oh, so you think if it could happen in the future more than what happened already?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Well, we're going to wind down this podcast with Dave.
Yeah, we have to go pick up our daughter, and then we're going to go out for dinner.
Yeah.
Where should we go? Oh, I'm excited to figure out where we're going to go.
The suspense,
McDonald's?
Killian.
Let's go to McDonald's.
Please, no. What we've been asking our guests towards the end of our time together is to think back to their kindergarten self and wonder what they would tell their kindergarten self. So what would you tell kindergarten Dave?
So being the annoying lawyer, I have to ask a follow-up question before I answer that.
Objection!
Is the 5-year-old me able to handle adult thoughts, or is it the actual 5-year-old me that I'm time traveling to and I have to explain it in a way a 5-year-old would understand?
I would think that the 5-year-old you could understand adult thoughts, Dave.
No, the 5-year-old me was a typical 5-year-old.
Then go back and tell the 5-year-old in terms that he can understand at the time.
Okay, so I guess this has a creative piece to it, which is this collaborative effort. Something I didn't do that I should have done more of. I would go back and tell myself that you might not believe this, but the more people you get to know, the better your life's going to be. So go out and actually try to make friends with every single person in your class.
Oh, that's great.
Excellent. Thanks, Dave. That's David Casimir. Oh, one more thing. If people want to get in touch with you, how would you like them to find you?
Or learn more about your work and your patents, because your patents, I think, are listed somewhere.
Yeah,
Dave has some
if they
patents.
just Google my name, they'll hit my work website. I think it's the first hit.
You're the only David Casimir out there.
There are some other ones, and you'll see some artwork that is not mine. That's a bit risque.
Okay.
And actually, at one point, that other David Casimir, I think, made a snarky reference to me on their website.
Ooh.
Because we were sort of competing for first hit.
Oh, sure.
On Google. But just Google my name and my website.
Are you open to, if people are really interested in your opinion on something?
Send me an email is the best way to get through to me.
Excellent. All right. That's David Casimir. Thanks, everybody. We're going to go out for dinner. See you later.
Creativity.